All right, everyone. Thank you for coming today. My name is Jenny Christ. I work for Penn State Extension and the Center for Ag Conservation Assistance Training. Probably a lot of you already know me, but again, thank you for coming. We are going to review an ACAP biosecurity update today. And if you have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat. We will try to answer all of your questions as we go through. And yeah, with that, I think I'm going to get started. So this ACAP biosecurity update, of course, is, in collaboration with the Pennsylvania State Conservation Commission. And we are here ultimately to talk about HPAI. And so in case you aren't aware, HPAI is highly pathogenic avian influenza. And this is a catastrophic disease in poultry, especially turkeys and mature chickens. They show symptoms that look like sudden death or some sort of respiratory distress. They'll have decreased energy, feed, and water consumption, and they will also have decreased egg production. And they can also have diarrhea and some other, common flu type symptoms, but it really is a catastrophic disease in poultry. And a few years ago, there were some individuals noticing that their dairy cattle just weren't quite being the normal high quality performers that their dairy cattle have been. And so through, a lot of questions and answers, and then finally someone connected all of the dots, they realized that HPAI was showing symptoms in dairy cattle. Now there are much milder symptoms. We'll see decreased feed intake and of course decreased milk production. There will be some respiratory signs, including nasal discharge, but then they also might have abnormal manure and or milk. And so, combining all of that, we realized that the HPAI was affecting more than just the birds. And so right now, HPAI, the current status here in the United States. So I pulled this map this morning from the USDA APHIS website. I chose the parameters so that, we were talking about all flocks, whether they're backyard or commercial. And since the outbreak started, so HPAI, the outbreak for HPAI started in February of 2022. And so the thing that I really want to note here is that every state, including Alaska, Hawaii, and Puerto Rico, which is a territory, not a state, of course, but every state territory in the United States has been affected by HPAI. There's been some sort of outbreak in every state since it started in 2022. And then in addition to that, we are also discovering that HPAI is being found in wild and captive mammals. And so it's been detected in a variety of different mammal species. You can see here on this slide, including bears and domestic cats, raccoons, rodent skunks, and wild dogs. So you can see where animals have been tested and detected to have HPAI. And so just thinking about the movement of these animals, it's not just the avian species that are transmitting HPAI. Mammals are also part of that conversation. And so here in Pennsylvania, our last reported detection was on March 27th of 2026, so only a few days ago. And currently there have been 60 affected commercial flocks, 72 affected backyard flocks, and a total of 15.9 million birds affected in the total outbreak. So the cases since the beginning in 2022. And so that's a lot of birds that have been affected by HPAI. This is a map from the Department of Ag, and it shows where in Pennsylvania we are dealing with HPAI at the moment. And so any county that is red, it means that an infection has been detected. Any county that is orange is considered a control area. And so a control area had a previous infection, and all infected premises within that control area have to have completed their depopulation and disposal of birds and feed and litter and eggs. And they have to have a 14-day period where there's no positive test results. during that time to be released from that control area. And then the yellow are surveillance areas. And so I'd actually presented this last week at boot camp, and there was the map looked different because we didn't have any of these yellow here in the eastern part of the state. But within the past few days, there has been a positive detection in New Jersey. And so that has added some more counties to our surveillance areas. And so there's been a lot of movement and action with HPAI, and something that we want to think about. And so, today we're going to talk about what I'm calling biosecurity must practices. And biosecurity is not optional. It's going to apply to every farm, every day of our interactions. And it also applies to every visit to that farm. So whether we're visiting construction sites, we're doing inspections or status reviews, biosecurity must be practiced during these visits. We want to start out and be prepared, right? And so bringing biosecurity supplies with us for every visit. This would include scrubbable boots, disposable boot covers, hand sanitizer, a bucket and a scrub brush, cleaner, and disinfectant. And as a note, any disinfectant that's used should have a label claim against influenza viruses. So it's necessary to read the label to make sure that your disinfectant is actually effective against influenza and to follow all label instructions. So disinfectants are actually labeled and registered pesticides. And so the label is the law, and for the product to be effective, the instructions need to be followed. And one of the biggest things I like to note about disinfectants is that they have a time the surface should remain wet for them to actually do the thing that they say that they do in their instructions. And this time that the surface needs to remain wet can vary from 10 minutes to seconds, depending on the product. And the EPA, so the Environmental Protection Agency, has a nice landing page that lists all the different registered products that are effective against avian influenza. And the thing I like a lot about that website is that it actually lists the time that products need to stay wet. And so I'm going to throw that in the chat so that if you are interested, you can check it out. It gives you an idea of how long that disinfectant needs to actually stay wet for it to do the thing that it claims to do. And then we also need to make sure that we have trash bags and water with us whenever we are going to the farm. And so before you visit the farm, you want to communicate with the farmer, landowner, operator, whoever is really responsible for the day-to-day activities, at least 24 hours prior to that visit. Ask about the presence of poultry, including backyard flocks. So I feel like a lot of times when we talk to somebody, we're like, oh, what kind of livestock do you have on your farm? They're like, oh, I have a herd of beef cattle. And that's it. And they forget to include that they have 50 chickens running around laying eggs and having a good time. And so it's important to ask specifically about the presence of poultry on their operation. We want to discuss any site-specific biosecurity concerns and procedures. Certain farms will have procedures in place, others will not. And so it's important to know which farms do and which farms don't. And we always want to follow those farms' procedures, especially if they're more restrictive than what we are doing. If they are less restrictive, then we want to keep doing what we are doing. We want to identify any restricted areas, so any places on the operation that we should not be going to, restricted by the farmer or by what's happening on their farm. It's also really important to confirm the parking location and the meeting time. One of the things we don't want to do is show up on a farm and start walking around looking for the farmer. It's best to have that meeting time and location confirmed so that you don't have to go looking for the farmer. When you arrive, you want to follow all posted biosecurity signage, park in that predetermined or designated areas only. We want to avoid animal housing, manure storages, muddy or high traffic areas. We want to avoid feed bunker, silage leachate, anything that might be part of that transmission of a biosecurity concern. If there is a visitor's log, you want to sign that. Again, some farms will have that, not all, of course. We want to wear clean and disinfected footwear or disposable booties. But the best practice is to scrub and disinfect your boots upon arrival to the farm, because you don't know what you may have come in contact with on your way to that farm, especially if you made any stops on the way. So our best practice is going to be to scrub and disinfect our boots upon arrival. I personally am a big fan of disposable booties. It really, for me, it saves that step because I put those on as I'm getting out of the vehicle, and I don't have to worry about doing the scrubbing of the boots upon arrival because I've covered myself with those disposable booties. So on-site biosecurity must practices, we do not want to enter animal housing. And we want to avoid direct contact with animals, including pets. And we want to stay clear of animal pens and feed areas, manure and compost, standing water, fan exhaust, or any equipment that's used to handle manure or feed. So I realized that sometimes we actually do have to go into these high-risk areas, right? Especially if doing any surveying or working on a design for that operation. And so if you are required to go into those high-risk areas, such as the animal pens, animal concentration areas, or other areas with manure and mud, it's essential to thoroughly remove all organic matter from your boots and all equipment, and then disinfect when you are getting ready to leave. So best practice is to stay clear of all of those areas, but there are, of course, exceptions when you are doing your job, right? So when you have to go into an animal area for surveying, it's understandable. So we just need to take extra steps to remove all of that organic matter and disinfect our equipment. And whenever you're visiting a farm, we need to move, let's be clear, we need to move from areas of lower disease pressure to higher disease pressure. So thinking about animals that have been exposed to things and maybe have built up immunity. So, our youngest animals are going to have the lowest disease pressure. They've had the least exposure to any sort of diseases that may be on that farm. And so we want to move from the youngest animals up to the oldest animals. And then ultimately, if we are visiting a mortality composting, we want that to be our last place that we visit, because those animals, of course, are already dead and they can't get any more sick. So we want to start with the young and then move to the dead, depending on what all is at that farm. And so when you're getting ready to leave, before you enter your vehicle, you want to remove and bag your boot covers, or you're going to scrub and disinfect your boots. You also want to scrub and disinfect any tools or equipment that you used at the farm. Best practice is to leave the waste on site. So if you did use boot covers and you've bagged them, the best practice is to leave that waste on site. Now, I realize that there are some operations where that may not be an option. And so if that's the case, I hope that you have a dumpster at your office, and so you can stop at the dumpster and dispose of that waste before then you park your vehicle and head inside. And then, of course, we want to wash or sanitize our hands. I know washing hands can always be tricky out on a farm. We don't always have access to water, especially warm water when it's cold outside, and soap. And so sanitizing is also an option. But again, make sure that hand sanitizer is labeled for influenza, and you rub it in and leave it on your hands for the time that it needs to be on your hands to do the job. And so right now, if we're visiting any operation, we really should have a minimum of 24-hour downtime between visits to same species farms. Again, unless more restricted guidance is provided, right? So we want to have at least 24-hour downtime between visits to two horse farms. If we have to do a horse farm one day, we want to spend at least 24 hours before we go to a horse farm again. We want to not rewear unwashed clothing. We want to ensure that our footwear and our equipment are stored in a location free of contamination. And it is important to wash the vehicle, including the undercarriage, to remove mud and manure. Now, if you didn't, hopefully you don't have to drive through any mud or manure. And so this is not as important if you haven't done that. But if you did drive through mud and manure, it's important to wash your vehicle, including that undercarriage, to remove that organic matter. Okay. And we also want to consider like our outerwear too, because sometimes we wear the same coat day after day after day, especially when it's cold outside. And so we want to think about that too. And best practice would be to wash that in between visits. And I know that is a lot to think about, but it really is the best practice. So right now, of course, we are in a period of heightened biosecurity concern with the elevated threat of HPAI. And so the Department of Ag and the State Conservation Commission are requiring a 72-hour downtime visit to operations with qualifying species. And so right now, qualifying species are going to include an operation with any number of dairy and or poultry animals. So for example, you're heading out to a swine operation to, check in on an upcoming ACAP project, and you realize, oh, they have a backyard poultry flock. So now that swine operation becomes a qualifying species farm visit. And so now you are required to have 72-hour downtime between visits to another operation that has dairy or poultry animals. Some additional biosecurity must practices. So avoiding high-risk areas before farm visits. So think about areas where migratory birds like to hang out, congregate, visit, take over. When I worked in Cambria County, there was a county park that we would sometimes stop at for lunch before, between farm visits. And then that park was always overtaken with Canadian geese. And it got to the point where we no longer went to that park because it was too high risk of an area. Think about the feed store and how many farmers come in and out of that feed store and may have not cleaned or changed their boots before leaving their farm. And even the ag community's favorite early morning hangout spot. So I was recently talking to a colleague and they said that, they worked in the poultry industry, and in the morning, all of the local farmers would come and hang out and chit chat and get coffee. And it raises a lot of questions when we're talking about biosecurity, because I think sometimes we forget that we can also be transmitters of these diseases, bacteria, viruses, whatever. And so try to avoid those areas where people are hanging out. And so if you are somebody that's interested in hunting or fishing, or you interact with avian species, make sure to clean your vehicle, your boots, your equipment, and your phone, and to launder any clothes, outerwear, hats, gloves, etc., that you may have used while doing those activities that you also use at work. So thinking about ACAP, right? ACAP-specific. So project visits need to continue, and we're very well aware of that. And so thinking about, pre-application site visits, designing visits, pre-bid showings, pre-construction meetings, construction inspections, right? And final project verifications, all of these things need to continue to happen. And so we need to think ahead about biosecurity and what can be done, maybe scheduling that initial meeting with that farmer about their application. Is that possible to do virtually or over the phone? Again, discussing farm-specific biosecurity risks and procedures. And anytime you are responsible for bringing people together at a farm, whether it's, thinking about a pre-bid showing, a design visit, pre-construction meeting, insist that biosecurity procedures are followed by everyone at all project visits. And again, one of the things that I find is people are less interested in scrubbing and disinfecting. And so by making disposable booties the standard, it helps to eliminate some of those questions and concerns and pushback, and if people are actually scrubbing their boots or just pretending. And so, I think disposable booties really can alleviate some of that stress. And so trying to think about logistics and realizing that, yes, 72 hours of downtime is required between visits between a dairy or a poultry operation. However, if you're visiting the same dairy operation repeatedly for construction inspections, that is acceptable without that 72-hour downtime. But again, make sure that you're still following all of those biosecurity procedures. And as a note, if you have ACAP admin or technical assistance funds available in your county, they can be used to purchase biosecurity supplies and for vehicle washes. Those are approved expenses if you have admin or technical assistance funds available. And if you have questions about where to buy any sort of biosecurity supplies, specific procedures, just interested in having more of a discussion on that, of course, I am always available to, provide guidance, insight, answer your questions. And so ultimately, biosecurity is part of our professional responsibility. Our small actions can help protect the entire agricultural system. We want the community to believe and trust in us, and practicing biosecurity is one of those ways that we can show them that we care about the agricultural community as a whole.